You know, Phyllis, I was trying to think of how to describe you to somebody who might not know all the things you've done, the work you've done as a professor, the work you've done as a teacher. And I believe, and you'll tell me whether you're comfortable with it, I believe you are not only an author, a writer, a thinker, but a social commentator on the American scene. And for that matter now, you also care very deeply about the state of Israel. But you have the opportunity here to meet a woman who has done extraordinary work writing on feminist issues, on social issues, and on the state of Israel. Incidentally, can I ask, as you look back at your life, your childhood growing up, who your parents were, it had to come from somewhere. You don't become who you are by accident. A person who, you already mentioned this, you're the kind of person who is driven to, you should excuse the dumb phrase, tell it like it is. And whatever you're writing about, whatever you're trying to comment about, you are driven to be as honest as you can be and let the chips fall where they may. That comes from somewhere, Phyllis. Is it your parents? Is it your upbringing? Did something happen to you in high school or college? At what point do you become Phyllis Chesler?
Oh, what a good question. I grew up in Borough Park. I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family. My rebellion was to join Hashomer HaTzayir. And when the rabbis were brought in to Geshrai on me, I joined Ein Charod, which was to the left of Hashomer HaTzayir. Now, I'm sure that this vision of liberation
yes.
and tied to an understanding of persecution has influenced me and inspired me and driven me. That's a good phrase. And I put aside Jewish things until I became well known as an author. And then it was clear that the return of anti-Semitism in the late 1960s, early 1970s, then I didn't break with feminist or left groups yet, but I was trying to keep them honest about all kinds of racism. And then I'd say over the next 20 years, I was involved with feminism in Israel, and I became involved in Torah study and became one of the co-leaders of Nashim Shel HaKotel, the Women of the Wall, who've been trying to daven at the Kotel. And that's a very important struggle, which we lost in the Israeli Supreme Court, but the women continue to pray anyway. And as I was reading this portrait of Emma Lazarus, which I wrote for, a publisher approached me to do a book about Jewish women who had changed the world. And I chose her among an interesting mix, but the publisher went under, chaval. So when they asked me about Emma Lazarus, I found this, and I now see how important a historical figure she was and how little known it is. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. One moment on the American scene, then we'll come back to the Jewish scene. As one who fought for feminist rights from the moment the issue really took hold here in the United States, how have we done? As you look now, as we near the latter part of the first decade of the 21st century, are you pleased with where the American social experiment is in relationship to accepting and welcoming women's roles in our overall society?
You have nothing but good questions for me. The kind that it's hard to answer.
Yes,
that's why they're good. There's been an enormous sea change, and yet we are still in the desert. We have so far to go. So that while we have a greater understanding of, for example, domestic violence, including rape and incest and sexual harassment, that doesn't mean we've abolished it. And that doesn't mean that we can prevent it or rescue its victims. So the consciousness has undergone a sea change, and it's been global. But the work continues, and the work becomes harder, especially if younger people have inherited certain changes and don't understand how fragile and how precious those rights are.
Do you have a feeling that the younger generation sees less of a distinction between male and female? Has there been progress from your perspective when you look at today's younger generation?
I'm not sure. Feminism became a dirty word. And it requires a lot of courage to say I'm a feminist, whether it's a male or female. I have to think about that.
Okay, fair
I have
enough.
to think.
There's an obvious question that comes out of your being someone from an Orthodox Jewish background. Within the Orthodox Jewish community, there is significant role difference between men and women. And when you speak to most committed Orthodox Jewish women, their answer is they do not feel in any sense that they're second class, that what they feel is there is simply a different role for them and their husband, and that when they come together, there's a whole, meaning W-H-O-L-E.
No, I understand.
Okay. To what extent now did you in any way experience those same feelings from your mother, from your grandmother, and to what extent did you feel you were in some way breaking with a traditional Orthodox vision, I say vision, traditional Jewish vision of woman when you became so much a part of the feminist movement here in America?
I think in the beginning I didn't understand how much I was breaking. Now, much later on, I understand. I know many Orthodox feminists
Yes.
who are fighting for agunot, who are fighting for all kinds of women's rights. And I know many perfectly nice Orthodox women who are not, who are content with a separate sphere. I don't think feminists ever said everyone has to be the same, that we all have to do the same thing in lockstep, because that's a totalitarian vision. So there is a power and a greatness to keeping the tradition whole and not breaking it. But there's an equal power in weaving in the new themes at this moment in history, which will never return, so that our insights are then part of that tradition.
At one point, Phyllis, the feminist movement seemed to be saying that choosing, if a woman chose to be in the home, a homemaker, a mother, a wife, that somehow they were betraying the feminist movement. Where did you stand on that issue? Where do you stand on it now?
I had a minority position from the start because I've written 3 books about motherhood. With Child, A Diary of Motherhood, which is out of print, and which my son, who's here, introduced when he was about 20 years old. And I wrote a book about divorce and custody, and I wrote a book about surrogacy and motherhood. So from the beginning, I understood that motherhood was a sacred right, both R-I-T-E and R-I-G-H-T. And I was the minority view among feminists, understandably, because they had seen generations of women consigned to mother only, wife only, and don't leave home. And they were trying to break free of that. I think they lost the majority of women in America because they didn't understand that, for example, fighting for child support or for women's equal custody rights would be as important as fighting for women's reproductive rights or employment rights. So I've been on the minority in this area.
As you look back, did the feminist movements make any serious mistakes you wished were corrected?
Yes, and I've written about it. Feminists were afraid to look at the way in which women, like men, are sexists, and the way in which women are highly competitive and sabotage each other, and this means feminists too. The failure to look at that, the preferred view was that women are morally superior to men, so take that. And it's not true. It's a nice idea, but it's not true. I mean, there were women who collaborated with every rotten regime that has ever existed, and opportunistically so. That was a big failure because women were burned out by the problem that they wouldn't name, which I've called woman's inhumanity to woman. Right now, let me focus on something. Feminism has failed the question, am I my sister's keeper? Because now feminism has become multiculturally relativistic, and so they are too politically correct to denounce the mistreatment of women under Islam. because that seems, quote, racist. And that concern trumps their concern with women's survival. This is a huge mistake, but it's one that didn't get made until perhaps by the end of the 1980s. And now it is going to doom us.
Okay, I want to talk for one moment about Israel, and I want to bridge the feminist Israel issue by asking you if you have any opinion on the controversy that swirled Ms. Magazine when there was an attempt to put an ad in Ms. Magazine lauding the contribution of Israeli women who happened to be viewed from within Ms. Magazine as on the right,
Well,
and
but
therefore,
it was the president of the Supreme Court, the Speaker of the Knesset.
you remember the women who were going to be?
Yes.
Who were the women who were going to who the ad wished to celebrate, which Ms. Magazine refused to accept?
Dorit Beinish, who actually found for Women of the Wall in the second and third decision for us. Tzipi Livni, who may be the next prime minister, who knows, and Dalia Itzik, who I think is the Speaker of the Knesset. Am I right?
Right.
Okay. Now, I was involved in the press conference that condemned Ms. for their foolish. I mean, I would have loved to broker a truce, and I made phone calls, but I didn't get a return answer. So the American Jewish Congress asked me to please come and stand, which I did. It was Blue Greenberg, myself, and Francine Klagsbrun. And for the record, let me say that many Jewish feminists and some Muslim feminists refused to come because they said Ms. funded them, and Hollywood and Washington, D.C., and axis of influence, and they wouldn't dare offend them even if it was the truth. And I took enormous heat for being involved, enormous heat. And the issue was, why not run an ad that the Congress was willing to pay for? Of course, what I said to the Congress is, why do you want to advertise there? You know, what's the point? So it could have been handled better. And not every feminist at Ms., hates Jews. But I would say the prevailing political climate is that Israel is an apartheid Nazi-like state that is oppressing the purest and most noble of victims, the Palestinians. We, the Jews, are the Palestinians. And that no feminist or progressive worth her salt would have a kind word to say for Israel. So anti-Semitism is now anti-Zionism, which in my opinion is racism. So I said all these things, and the hatred that I got from some feminists who are polishing their legacy of having been in the forefront of the creation of Ms. Magazine, being connected with those who are part of that world, as I was. Yes. They cannot bear to have any flaw show, which is a shame. And in fact, somebody who I won't name, I called her up and I said, you shunned me, at a funeral. Can we please be civil at such settings? And she said, you are too dangerous to talk to. She said, you are too dangerous to the women's movement. She's confusing Ms. Magazine with the women's movement. And she said, how could you have done that? And then she was on and running. And I realized that I'd really hurt her, that I'd hurt them. And very often when one takes a position on the side of truth or justice, you also hurt people who've got their bread is buttered, and you're hurting them, right? So that's how it is.
All right, so I need some advice from you. I came out of the liberal tradition, and at the same time I'm passionate about the Jewish tradition, I'm passionate about the state of Israel. I don't believe issues are black and white. I don't believe the Israeli-Palestinian issue is black and white. But I certainly feel that the way in which the state of Israel has bent over backwards in an impossible situation is very much overlooked by the left.
Totally.
And here you are, someone who cut your teeth on the left. And you are liberal, you've been associated with liberal causes your entire life. How does somebody who comes out of the liberal tradition, who at one point was seen to be somewhat on the left, how do you handle this personally? Where do you go with this, Phyllis? especially because you love the state of Israel too, and you don't see this as a liberal right-wing issue.
No.
You see this as a matter of justice. But I'm curious to know from you, how do you answer somebody like me who says, I grew up very liberal. I still believe socially I'm committed to liberal causes in many, many, many ways, and I don't consider my support for Israel to be in any way a contradiction to that. But at the same time, it becomes more and more difficult.
I have the question. The problem is that the current left liberal academic groups are making common cause with Islamic fundamentalists, with totalitarian entities in a very nihilistic fashion. Okay? So they have betrayed truly those civil libertarian ideals of democracy and of justice. They have utterly betrayed these ideals. Now, I do not think when one breaks with the politically correct line, you lose all your friends overnight. That is what happens. And you learn that they weren't really your friends. They were members of a cult that shared the same ideology, and that the personal friendship didn't matter, because friends should be able to disagree on certain things in a civilized fashion. That is not the case today. There's a huge chasm between what is called or maligned as neoconservative right-wing and what is maligned and called left-wing. Right? It's a huge chasm. So if you speak for Israel or for Jews, you will overnight lose most of your Jewish friends who are liberal left. Why? Because they take so seriously the Tikkun Olam mandate, but they've ripped it from a religious context. And so with great zeal and fanaticism, they are going to be dealing with everybody's oppression, but not the Jews. They're going to have compassion for everyone's suffering, but not the Jews. This is an interesting issue. So you will lose your worldly connections, your publishing opportunities, your private friendships will simply go. Now, there's no looking back. There's no choice. This is what happens, and not just to me, but to anyone else who's made a similar kind of voyage now. Now, you discover that you make other kinds of friends. And the sad thing is that these other kinds of friends, you didn't know them when you were 20 or 30 or 40 even. And so it's a different kind of bonding.
This woman here, Phyllis Chesler, is one of the great women of our generation.
Oh,
and it's
you.
so sweet of you to take a moment to talk to me.
My pleasure.
I wish
Pleasure.
you only the best, and I hope there'll be other times for us to talk together.
Absolutely.
Phyllis Chesler, who received today the Emma Lazarus Award at the first Emma Lazarus Award ceremony. Thank you, darling.